Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for all the comments and all the engagement. Really appreciate it. Today we have Padman Vamadevan and we have Ben Whately, the founders of Astron Health. They're looking at cancer and oncology in a very sort of unconventional way and doing something very unique. So, Pad and Ben, thanks for coming on.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure's ours. I've been looking forward to this one. I think a nice place to start is, how did you both come to found Astron, and what's the point of Astron existing in the world?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Padman Vamadevan. I'm a medical doctor based in London, although Astron is actually a very global initiative. And I've spent my 18 years career as a doctor mostly at the kind of crossroads of cancer medicine and something called clinical pharmacology, which is really a practice of general medics to try and understand how drugs truly affect patients. So not just what they do, their sort of primary purpose, but what other effects they might have off target in the body. So my focus has always been on understanding not just how we treat cancer, how we kill cancer cells, how we improve scans, but why it grows, why it spreads, why it recurs, and what we can do about it in the most practical way possible. So I started out very much on the path to becoming an NHS academic, saw all the kind of professors around me, looked at people who were retiring, who had been incredibly successful in their career, working at the top institutions, and actually looked at practically what they had been able to change in their 40 years of research. And it wasn't as much as I would hope to change myself. So I had an opportunity back in 2016 to join a biotech company that was really focused on drug repurposing, which is a massive opportunity. As you know, creating new drugs for anything, but particularly for cancer, takes a long time and costs a lot of money. So this field of drug repurposing, taking drugs that are already out there and using them for new indications, was incredibly exciting. And these drugs are well known, they're low toxicity, they're cheap. And that period at Cure-or-Oncology, where I was medical director, kind of changed everything for me. Some of the results we saw were fairly astounding. We used a very static platform of 4 drugs, but we published an incredible paper in very aggressive brain cancers, and that kind of demonstrated to not just me, but I suppose the whole world, about the power of this kind of approach. But I was also very focused in that journey that we were helping certain patients. 30-40% of patients were really responding very well to that non-personalized approach, that kind of protocol-driven approach, which is kind of how we treat cancer anyway. But I was very focused on the 60-70% that weren't. And I wanted to understand why. And that's what kind of led me down the journey to co-founding Astron with Ben and Myron, who's our tech co-founder. And essentially, we really believe that at a root cause level, that every single individual's cancer is very, very personalized. Okay, you can have 2 people with the same cancer on paper, and when we actually look at it under the hood, there can be completely different drivers at every level, at a genomic level, at a metabolic level, at an environmental level, at an infection level, or an immune system level. It's really tough, therefore, to give people treatments personalized to their own disease. And so at Astron, really, we have we don't have theories. We don't start from the top and work our way down. We try and understand the truth for every cancer from the ground up, understanding what's driving their disease at a molecular level, and then trying to find really smart, evidence-based ways to interrupt those alterations. So that's kind of what's led me here. I met Ben along the way. I'm sure he'll tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I pick up from there, I guess. My background is totally non-medical. I studied computational neuroscience 20 odd years ago at Oxford, where I got very interested in how you train machine learning models and neural networks. And particularly from that, I got into founding startups. I founded a language learning business that we grew to 80 million users. And then from that, I started getting interested in this, I got seduced by the magic of startups as a methodology and as a kind of quasi-scientific approach to find maximum leverage to change the world as it is at the moment. And there's something kind of incredible about this approach to building a business, which is therefore a self-perpetuating machine that can make changes happen in society and in the world. And being a successful startup is really about getting a very driven team to use a very scientific approach to uncover really intense problems in the world that people are experiencing and that people are trying to solve at the moment, and working out how to solve it. And usually those are problems that haven't been able to be solved before, but suddenly are being unlocked by some technology or by a societal change or by a cultural change. And so these startups come into play when there are big shifts happening, technological, cultural, social. And so through building startups myself, I've got very interested in that. I then spent a lot of the last few years investing in other startups and mentoring founders, helping other people get their businesses off the ground. As part of that, I teach on a startup MBA program called One Day, where people build a business as they get their MBAs. And it was there that I met Pad, who had come on, and we started talking about exactly this problem space and the work that he'd been doing. And as he's just said, the kind of frustration that you've got this approach of treating the molecular level drivers of recurrence and progression in cancer with everything from lifestyle changes, repurposed drugs, supplements. But historic approaches to that were difficult to do because you didn't know exactly what the drivers were for each individual. We knew that they were all different, but there was no way to know exactly what distinguishes each of the patients. The technology that's kind of unlocked this, which got me really excited that this is a point where a startup can really make a difference. The model of building startups can really make change in the world here, is that the tests that can now shine that torch on what are the unique molecular drivers of each patient's disease. Those tests have just dropped in price by about 90% over the last 10 years and have got more accurate at the same time. So we now have better information, much more cheaply available. And that means for the first time, we can look at what are the drivers of each individual's disease. Now, because this is so new, we don't yet have all the information on what are the best ways to treat those diseases, those drivers. And that puts patients in a difficult position, because patients now have access to this information of what are the drivers. But then the world is just flooded with really strong opinions from people on what the answers are to to curing cancer. And people have really strong opinions that may be true, very unlikely to be true for everybody, because everyone's disease is different. But it's really, really hard for patients to unpick that. And so what we're really doing with Astron is creating this service that is like your research partner, a reliable research partner that each oncologist doesn't have time to understand each patient's drivers in detail and go and do all of the reading on thousands of different papers that have been published every year and understanding what is the best evidence that we have given the drivers of this individual's disease. It's just not a humanly possible task. And this is something where we can employ AI systems to look at and analyze all of the research papers really, really quickly. I mean, I say really quickly, even using AI at the latest level now, it still takes months to go through the 170,000 plus papers that we need to review. But it gives us a way of doing all of that review, prioritizing the quality of research against each other. And then what we can give the oncologist and the patient is this research summary that just says, given this patient's molecular profile, here is the research that you need to look at. And this is really robust, reliably ranked so that they can very quickly get to the most important information. And what this does for patients is basically allows them to just cut through all of that noise, all of that confusion, all of these very certain voices who have done research, they've come to ideas, and it's kind of in this world at the moment, you have to be really certain, otherwise no one listens to you. So I totally understand why people have to say, we've got the answer, because otherwise no one listens to people being equivocal. But the fact is, every patient is different, and therefore each individual patient can listen to 20 different people who are certain and not know which is the right way to go. And what we're trying to give is that platform that can give a really robust way of cutting through that noise and seeing, okay, here is the best research ranked on these parameters. That's how I can understand what research is most relevant to me. And then the oncologist can look at that and make a recommendation.
Brilliant. I mean, thank you so much for the little bit of background from you both, because you can see how you both come to it from very different perspectives, but yet how it's sort of the unique combination of minds can actually achieve something quite interesting. You mentioned theories, Pad, and I thought it was an interesting place to jump off, because my mum went through a cancer journey last summer. She's got the all clear now, which is wonderful, but we felt we were getting caught up in ideology, right? And these different theories where if you go to one school of thought, it's brilliant, but only to the boundaries of that school of thought. And actually, it seems like what you guys are doing is you're jumping these ideological boundaries from the bottom up, as opposed to top down sort of theory, and sort of staying within that silo, right? You're sort of very, very broad in your approach, because as you say, it's not one size fits all. So with that in mind, Ben, you mentioned the sort of how you rank different studies. How do you rank different studies with that approach in mind, where you're not trying to succumb to any one individual ideology? How do you both think about that?
Yeah, so I can start, and then Pat, you fill in with the more sciencey bit. So broadly, the bioinformatics engine here that we built is a large language model that's been trained on PubMed publications, so huge number of, so it gets very good at reading medical publications. Then we actually further fine-tune that using a technique called named entity recognition that allows us to get it even better at pulling out drug target relationships from all of those papers. That allows us to create a very long list based on all mutations, all potential drivers of treatment options that, or of research that looks at specific treatment options that are matched to those. Then we do a whole load of prioritization on that. We do prioritization based on the quality of the journal, on the quality of the authoring team, on the number of citations. So just very factual, does the scientific community rate this piece of research, or is it just a random lab from somewhere that has done something and published it in a journal no one's heard of? So there's that level. Then we look at, we cross-check it with publicly available data sources on things like the binding energy that is understood in bioinformatics databases. So just cross-checking with other sources to see that. We then look at disease context. So things behave differently in different tissues and so on. And we add a layer of understanding that to rank it in relation to each individual patient. Then we also look at negative findings, so reasons why you might not take that drug, whether that's because you can't take it if you have limited liver function, or whether that's because it interacts with other drugs in a particular way. And so we try and draw out all of those things. I think those are the main factors, which then allows us to rank on those bases to say, from a quality of publication level, from a disease context level, from a general biology level, this is the ranking. And then finally, from are there any negative reasons why not to take this, to take out any treatment options? But it's really, it's a very structured way of ranking that data, that research, which then allows the clinician to get cut right to the information that is relevant for them, which they would be able to get to themselves. It would just take them literally hundreds of years, because that quantity of data is so absolutely enormous. Pat, did I miss anything important there?
No, I think that's perfect. And it brings me, I suppose, on to the other part of your question, Ben, at the start, which was around the distinction between our kind of bottom up n=1 root analysis approach and the kind of broader theories of cancer approach, where a lot of people start and work downwards. And I think this is really crucial for many reasons, right? But I think from a really practical standpoint, a lot of stuff that happens in the non-conventional, primary oncologist space doesn't actually get the traction that it deserves and probably that its data could bring, because the overarching philosophy gets in the way of people looking at the science properly. So if you go to a prestigious hospital with a bunch of oncologists that have practiced cancer a particular way for decades, who have had real success with some patients and unfortunately not as much with other patients, and you tell them that the way that they've been practicing and their beliefs about cancer have been incorrect, they're not going to hear anything else you say. And the thing is, to achieve that kind of transition in any field of medicine, but especially in cancer care, it can only really be done by data, right? And we see this even in cardiovascular medicine. For something as kind of basic as having a heart attack and the origin of plaques that cause clots in blood vessels, there is huge amounts of debate, given the trillions that have been spent on treating heart attacks and successfully preventing secondary prevention. It's a real model for how we want to treat cancer, not just treating the big clot, but also then preventing recurrence by optimizing blood pressure and cholesterol and, stopping people smoking and getting them exercising more, et cetera, et cetera. Again, having a heart attack is much less complex than having cancer. But the thing is, there's still huge amounts of debate about, is this an inflammatory mediated disease, or is it because you've got too much cholesterol in your blood? And do statins work by lowering inflammation in the blood vessels, or do they work by lowering LDL cholesterol? And you're never going to get quorum amongst everyone. And again, it's the extreme voices that speak out. So we are very minded that we have to be rooted in data and molecular evidence, not kind of washed away by a dogmatic philosophy. And I've kind of been around, I suppose, long enough to have understood that I can have two patients with exactly the same type of disease on paper, and I can treat them both exactly the same, and they can be incredibly compliant with everything that we're doing, and they can have two completely different outcomes, and part of that is because science always has gray areas. Every single test, every single scan, every single genomic test, there is always a sensitivity and a specificity. There's always things that get missed, and there's always things that sometimes get overdiagnosed. And the real skill of a doctor, the reason that our reports go to the doctors that treat patients, not just directly to patients, is because there is real nuance in being able to interpret the research and the data and create something personalized for the patient in front of you, taking into account their situation. And so we are incredibly translational and data driven. One of the main cores of what we do really is the quality of the data and the breadth of the data that we get in before we even commence our analysis, because that is a central point of truth. And for most oncologists, what they get is a few blood tests that check that you're safe to have treatment, that your white blood cells are high enough and your liver and your kidney and your bone profile are okay, and they get a scan. And a scan is a kind of macroscopic measure of what your disease is doing. But scans do funny things. If a scan gets taken immediately after chemo, the inflammation can make something look slightly bigger, even though the disease is improving. So it's not a complete point of truth. It needs to be nuanced. When we do molecular testing, historically, most molecular testing has been genetic in origin. So just looking at the DNA, the genomics, okay? And I'm sure most of your viewers will know this, but there's a central dogma in biology where DNA makes RNA and RNA makes protein. That's the DNA being the instructions, the RNA kind of being the tools, if you like, and the sort of intermediate steps, and the protein being the end product. And when we just look at DNA, often we miss things, because you might have a completely normal gene that looks completely normal on a genomic analysis, and so we would disregard it. But actually at Astron, we make a real effort to look at pathways and the expression patterns of those genes. So you might have a gene that looks completely normal on the DNA analysis, but when we measure the RNA, which is the gene expression, and the proteins, that gene might be overexpressed by a factor of 50. And if that gene's encoding something like, something that's enabling the cancer cell to divide more rapidly or create more blood vessels or signal more effectively, it can be a huge game changer for that patient. And we're just missing that. So part of what we do is target identification. That is super important. There's no use having great solutions and an amazing engine that's based on all this AI, and if we're missing the best targets. So that is part of the strategy. We focus on actionable vulnerabilities. That's the second bit, because at the moment, if we look just at DNA, and that's what conventional precision drug development in the cancer world does, they kind of try and find good targets to drug. And there are, the cosmic database from the Sanger Institute, where they catalogue the kind of genes that they think are relevant in cancer. There are over 750 potential driver genes. Now, in over 35 years of precision cancer drug development, we can only hit 46 of them. And that's because it takes 15 years and, a couple of $1 billion to create a new drug for cancer these days. So pharmaceutical companies are really driven by high value targets. So you find something like there's a gene called ALK, which is a gene that often goes wrong in lung cancer, but it's a fantastic target. And there are like 10 drugs that have been developed for that. And people with ALK positive lung cancer who go on one of these drugs do incredibly well. But there doesn't need to be 10 of them. There are lots of other potential targets that drug companies aren't working on because they may not be as good. There's more risk inherently, And the beauty of what we're doing at Astron is that we are agnostic. We're trying to find the best targets by looking, longitudinally at patients and seeing which ones are moving and which ones appear to be driving the disease in the here and now. And then we're trying to match those really important targets with the best available interventions using the kind of research-based platform that we've got. And we're completely agnostic. There might be some, particular pathways or genes or proteins which can be druggable by oncology drugs, non-oncology drugs, supplements, a ketogenic diet or caffeine or things like that. And I think, again, Ben's criteria earlier where we rank the research data by the quality of the research, that's going to continuously evolve. This is a rapidly evolving field. More research is coming out all the time. But it's really easy to lead patients to your particular philosophy by just showing them the particular studies or the case studies of the individual patients that have benefited. That's really not our approach.
I just wanted to, Ben, I just wanted to draw a little bit, or zoom in a little bit on something Pat said there, because I think it's really central to what we're doing, and maybe just explain it in slightly different words to make sure the point lands, that there is this, in heart disease, most of the money has gone into researching how to stop people having another heart attack. And it is the statins, the blood thinners, all of the lifestyle changes. And whereas in cancer, broadly, all of the research has gone into the primary treatment of how do we kill the cancer cells. And once you have gone through a program of treatment, whether it's surgery, whether it's chemo, whether it's radio, there's then this sort of a watch and wait strategy of let's just hope it doesn't come back. And historically, that's really been the only option, because the drivers of recurrence are so varied and so complex. And yes, there are some genes, some mutations, some targets like ALK that happens in a large enough proportion of lung cancer sufferers that can be a target to hit. But there are hundreds of others that happen in 2% of patients, 1% of patients that no one's ever going to develop a drug for. And they're so varied between patients that no one's been able to find that out in the past. And so no treatments have been developed for this secondary phase because we haven't been able to see it. In heart disease, it's like, do you have high cholesterol? There are a few drivers and you can test for them pretty easily. Whereas in cancer, those drivers have been invisible and they're totally varied across patients. And what we see is the unlock of that, as I said earlier, is this low-cost testing. But the opportunity here is that right now, virtually no patients get treatment to prevent recurrence and secondary progression. I think breast cancer has treatments for that, hormonal treatments, but aside from that, there's very, very little. We think that every patient should have that, and that's what this research allows us to unlock that. But we don't know what the answer is yet. We know that there is a lot of research already out there, published peer-reviewed research that is relevant to every patient, and we can help them make that link and find the right research that's relevant to them. But then it's equally important that we track those outcomes over time and get the data that simply doesn't exist yet, that says, how do people actually respond on these treatments? And that's where it's great for us to work with people who have particularly strong metabolic view, particularly strong view of whatever it is approach, because we can, whatever their approach is, we can link them to the most relevant research, and then we can see which ones these do empirically work and actually track those outcomes, which it's very rare for people to be able to invest in setting up that kind of long-term longitudinal registry study where we get the really detailed molecular data at the start that says, this is the profile of this patient, this is how they were treated, and look at that on an ongoing basis. And I think that's where we can really create incredible data set and incredible change in outcomes for patients.
It feels really multidisciplinary in nature, right? You guys aren't wedded by one ideology. You're very much open to exploring any and all, right? So long as the data and the research is credible behind it. And doing this podcast, I get to speak with really brilliant people. But often you can, there's a lovely essay. What was it? The fox and the hedgehog. The fox knows one thing well, and the hedgehog knows many things, right? But less well. And I often speak to brilliant people, and yet they're so focused on their research that I often wonder, as someone who's not in this world academically, I wonder what would happen if they sort of just opened their door and spoke to this person across, and it was a more multidisciplinary attack and more of an open door policy. So
yeah, and I think within cancer it's so difficult because it is so varied, but still we have this academic and cultural situation where people want to know that you have the answer, the cure, not that it's really, really complex. And it could be that these two totally different approaches both have success in different ways. And that kind of complexity is not something that lends itself well to individual people's careers. But and this is, I think, a really interesting application of AI. We hear a lot about AI, AI's role in the future curing cancer, being that it helps design of molecules, it helps design of particular drugs much, much faster. Well, I think our view is that there's a much nearer term and more impactful use of AI, which is to say there are already more than 100,000, 170,000 or so papers that are directly relevant to the targets in cancer and potential treatment options for those. We've already got an unbelievable amount of information. It's just that there's too much information to sort and find and prioritize by a human. And actually that is a great job for a really well structured LLM to do, is to filter the existing research to give us a kind of ground level of this is something that is not driven by an individual ideology, but is based on all of the best research that has already been published. And from that, we can generate the empirical data that actually says what did work and find it out from that end rather than leading with an adherence to a particular theory.
And the other thing I just wanted to add with that is, in terms of what you mentioned there, Ben, exactly what you said strikes a chord with me, because I knew that if I'd continued in my kind of academic journey, that would have exactly been what I did. I'd have to concentrate on a particular niche within cancer and try and, my focus would all have been on making sure my lab had the funds to, pay the PhD students and the postdocs for the next 5 years. And that's how it works, unfortunately. There's often people working at the bleeding edge of science, and there's 5 different groups across the world doing exactly the same work. and that duplication doesn't lend itself to patient benefit. So, one of the things that we founded out, I was looking at our vision traction planner the other day, and the main thing that we had was patient centricity and collaboration. So there are already testing companies doing a wonderful job. There are already doctors doing wonderful jobs. There are already metabolic, oncologists, people who are great minds in cancer biology, scientists and patients and lay people, whoever. And we want to use all of their inputs and respect all of their inputs and take that forward together, because it's really important. If we do a research report based on the best available science as it is now, as Ben said, it's not a complete picture. There's always more research to be done. There's always more data to be gleaned. So we could send that research report to 3 different doctors, and they will have 3 different opinions on what they should prescribe. And that's really super important, because that feedback, when we get the empirical data back from the patient as to what does the scan look like, what do the blood tests look like, how long were they stable for, what happened next, did they tolerate the protocols, it could be that there are patterns that the science hasn't established yet. But actually collecting the longitudinal data, and also collecting the longitudinal molecular data, which is the other bit that is going to completely delineate us from any other research group. Generally when we collect genomic or pathway data or proteomic data from patients, it's done at a point in time, either when they're first diagnosed or when they become metastatic or whatever it might be. But our aim is to collect this at time points, through the pathway of the patient, and that will enable us to identify what's driving the disease at different points. So we understand, okay, we don't need to give 40 different things all the time. Actually, at this phase, we give these 3 things, and at this phase, we give these 5 things. And that predictive analytic process makes life tolerable and proportionate. It makes it economically viable, both for a healthcare system and for a patient. And it means that actually, cancer can, we hope, our aim really is that we can start looking at it more as a chronic disease, rather than this binary thing where you're either completely cured or you're completely palliative, which has historically been the case. We don't talk about, diabetes or heart failure in the same way. And that's the kind of conversations that we want to be having, and we want to be able to bring a platform in that really drives that.
Wonderful. It makes a lot of sense. And I think if the listener isn't familiar with the history of how we've been treating cancer, highly recommend Tripping Over the Truth, and there's some other wonderful books just to see you can get a grasp of what humanity's been throwing at this for the last 60 years. And I guess things that come to mind, it's sort of a reductionist view of, here are 3 or 4 things that I hope, let's see if it works, best of luck, versus what you guys seem to be doing, which is viewing it as the complex adaptive system it is, right? You mentioned that you take a snapshot of the disease at one point, that might not be the case in 2 weeks' time. So completely get it. And it's sort of, these absolutes are, they're really rare birds, so it's much more complex than that. From the actual patient's point of view, can you walk us through? So let's say there's someone with cancer, like what does that actually look like using Astron for them, going through their cancer journey, I guess, with cancer, and then perhaps maybe like a recurrence. Maybe they've got the all clear, but they're conscious of recurrence. How does Astron help them on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, do you want me to take that one, Ben? Yeah, it's absolutely fine. So let's start with someone. We see both ends of the spectrum, actually. So we see people very much who have been macroscopically cured of their cancer. Maybe they've got an early stage diagnosis, they've had surgery and radiotherapy, and they've been told by their oncologist or their surgeon that there's no evidence of disease in their scan, and they're well, and they can be discharged. They can be followed up every year or whatever it might be. And those patients clearly come to us because they're worried about recurrence, and they want to know what they can do to limit recurrence. And so part of the study that we're setting up with one of the biggest universities in the UK actually at the moment is a registry study looking at exactly that group of patients with colorectal cancer, so stage 1 to 3 colon cancer, and who've been cured macroscopically. They've got no evidence of disease on a scan. Their tumour markers are normal. We know that about 30% of those patients are likely to recur at some point. Okay, and there are new molecular tests that can be done. They're called circulating tumour DNA tests, or MRD tests, where rather than looking for large lesions on a scan, they're looking for tumour DNA in the blood. So it's incredibly sensitive. And those tests have been validated so that if you've still got tumour DNA in your blood after you've had curative surgery, the risks of recurrence within a year are incredibly high. Okay. Now, at that point, that is a real blank space at the moment, because you can't operate on these patients because there's no lesion to operate on. This is like tumor DNA floating in the blood. You can't do radiation on those patients. There is absolutely no data to suggest that giving chemotherapy for those patients is a good thing. And again, it's a really heavy-handed approach. On the one side, chemo can kill cancer cells. On the other side, it can cause immune dysfunction and lots of toxicities. And again, we're not dealing with large numbers of cells here. We're dealing with floating bits of tumor DNA. And so that gives us a blank space where we're diagnosing these people with a high risk of recurrence, but there's no treatment that's available. And so our approach of understanding what the molecular drivers of their disease were at diagnosis, which was only a few weeks early when they had their surgery, understanding what was going on in the genes, in the pathways, and the proteins, and trying to match those with a protocol of safe medicines, supplements, even lifestyle sometimes, to see, number one, if we can prevent recurrence altogether, or at least delay recurrence for as long as possible, whilst providing a really cost-effective solution to the NHS. That is kind of where we are at the moment, because there are testing companies selling billions of these circulating tumor DNA MRD tests at the moment. But it's a real problem, because we're going to have these group of patients who get told by their surgeons there's really high risk of recurrence, but there's nothing we can do about it at the moment. And that's where we think our approach is completely novel. Okay, so that's that group of patients. And obviously, if we have patients who would like that kind of testing, who would like to come with Astron, we can absolutely organise that, and we can counsel them and tell them about what this testing does and doesn't do, whether it's right for them, what our approach might be thereafter. And essentially, the way that process would start is that they could come onto our website, or they could be referred by one of their doctors as well. We've got both pathways, but they could just come to astron.health. They could sign up initially for a call, a free call it's generally with myself or one of my colleagues on the scientific and medical team. And we will take them through everything that we do, all of the testing that we can offer. We can offer to speak to their oncologists or any other member of their scientific team as well, and then give them some more information about what we do. And if they decide to sign up, then it kind of becomes a question as to whether we are doing the testing as well, or whether they're having the testing done through their oncologist and they just want our research report. And both things are possible. Okay. And then there is a pathway there to organize the testing. We have logistic partners who will help collect their blood or their tissue, perform the testing at laboratories. Sometimes the laboratories in the UK, sometimes they're further afield. And then once those reports are back, we will use those reports to do our research. And our research report generally takes about 5 to 7 days to do. And then when we've done our research report, very happy to speak to the patient about it, but we generally send that back to the patient's oncologists. If they haven't got an oncologist that is well-versed in what we do, which is often the case, we also work with lots of partner cancer specialists who are really well-versed in the field of drug repurposing and integrative oncology. And they are also cancer-trained physicians, and therefore understand if the patient's on any other treatments, or, they understand blood tests and nuancing the protocols, and will often work with the primary oncologist to make sure that anything that is recommended or prescribed is okayed by that doctor as well. Okay, so that's the process for people who are in that kind of, we've been cured by surgery, but we want to reduce the risk of recurrence. For people who often come to us who are in the process of treatment at the moment, it's a very similar process. They sign up on our website, have a call with one of our team. We take them through all of the different options, and there are different tests that we offer, just as we are agnostic about the overall research and the interventions that may be brought out by the research. We also work with a lot of different testing partners, and every test is slightly different. They have different risks and benefits and possibilities. Sometimes patients have a recent biopsy sample, and therefore tissue is available for us to analyze. Sometimes it isn't, and we have to do a liquid biopsy from their blood, a blood-based biopsy. And so we might recommend different providers based on that. But again, a lot of our patients from the US will come, and they'll be directly referred by their oncologist to us. And a lot of patients in the US have already had molecular testing done. just because of the way the insurance system is there. Often molecular testing is just done as a standard part of the process. And we can use that report already to then do our research on. Okay. And once we've done our research, again, the report goes back to the oncologist or one of our partner oncologists who can then talk it through with the patient and develop a protocol with them. And we're always there in the background. We often have patients who want to understand a little bit more, and the reports are, we kind of write them in scientific language and also in a layperson's language so that patients can understand what's going on. Everything is completely referenced, so people can go to the individual papers from where the source data came from. And often we get patients and oncologists who call us and say, can we just go through this because this is quite cutting edge and we just need to understand a bit more. So we always provide that facility as well. Have I missed anything, Ben?
I mean, it sounds super novel in a good way, so different to standard of care, right? And such a leap forward, very progressive. How do you deal with, when you send the report to an oncologist, obviously oncologists differ in terms of, they probably don't take the same bottom-up approach you guys do. They might take 30 years in traditional oncology, whatever it is. How do you navigate the differences of opinion looking at your report? One report could be interpreted lots of different ways. How do you navigate that?
So I think a few ways to take that question. So firstly, in terms of oncologist opinions about our report, I think, as Ben made the point earlier, our report doesn't have any subjective opinion from ourselves in there. It is just correlating a language that they understand, i.e. the molecular testing reports. They are a language that oncologists understand all across the globe. You start talking to them about genes and transcriptomes, etc. They understand that language completely, and they believe that that is the approach to more precision oncology. And when you then marry that with the drug target data, which again is a completely objective approach, and you say, well, actually, this drug, this repurposed drug that you may never have even looked at in your life, and it's normally a blood pressure drug, or it's aspirin or metformin or something like that, actually binds this target, maybe not with the affinity of a tyrosine kinase inhibitor or some new biologic drug, but it does bind it, and it binds it at an incredibly low price point and an incredibly safe level. Yeah. And this is why we're giving it. And actually the engagement that we've had from oncologists almost across the board has been incredible, because what the approach has been now is to find the one gene, that they can hit with an expensive drug. And that one drug, one gene approach hasn't really worked, apart from a few exceptions that we discussed earlier. And a lot of the time it's because either you're hitting the wrong gene for that cancer at that moment in time, or you're hitting the right gene, but there's loads of other compensatory mechanisms occurring that you're not hitting at all. So it's easy for the cancer to escape and evolve, right? And so they fully understand, I think the majority of them fully understand, that there is a massive job to be done there in terms of being able to hit more targets. At the cardiovascular thing earlier, hitting the cholesterol is great for someone who's got familial high cholesterol, but if they've also got a sky high blood pressure and they're taking cocaine at the weekends and you're not targeting those bits, you're not going to be getting all of the benefit. And that's what we're trying to do here. So from that point of view, I think the engagement from oncologists has been excellent. The difficulty for them is in their toolkit is incredibly limited, right? So they have, chemo, surgery, radiotherapy, immunotherapies, biologics, some of the stereotactic radiotherapies as well, but that's kind of it. Yeah. And drug repurposing in that field, while drug repurposing is well established in cancer medicine, it always goes through that kind of clinical trials process to happen. Now, actually, repurposing a cancer drug, a really expensive TKI or immunotherapy, is expensive, and the side effects of those drugs can also be quite high. Yeah, so the risk is quite high for the cancer doctor doing that. The risk of prescribing someone aspirin and metformin is a lot lower. Yeah, so they are much less averse to the consideration of doing that. Their ability often to prescribe it themselves is not there, but they're very happy for it to be prescribed by another, specialist. Now, actually, then navigating that and doing this via a clinical trial, clinical registry study type thing, absolutely is our mechanism for getting more and more oncologists on board, because doing it in a research guise is completely acceptable, especially when you've defined the parameters, you define the potential pharmacological interventions, etc. So from that point of view, I think the reception's been very good, and they understand our process and our commitment towards the research process, okay, and data process. In terms of how do we cope with different people's takes on what to prescribe, actually we embrace it. Like, I love the fact that we send our reports to different doctors, and there might be a particular mutation. You know, we might have TP53, which is a really commonly mutated tumor suppressor gene. It's mutated in about 60% of people, and we might find, you know, 5 or 6 different potential targets, and we could send it to, you know, send that same mutation to 3 different doctors, and they would do 3 different things based on their own particular biases and experience in the past. And that for us is amazing for Astron. We need diversity and breadth of intervention, because, and that's why we're not doing this in-house. We could very easily curate a medical team in-house and say, right, we're going to do the consults and we're going to mark our own homework. But ultimately, for the algorithms and the empirical data set that we want to create, it wouldn't be as good, because we get narrow prescribing and we get maybe a positive result or a negative result, but we wouldn't get those outliers, those people that do really incredibly well. Because, you know, I don't know, a doctor in a far-flung part of the world is using her experience of, I don't know, a particular vitamin or something like that, and she believes in it, and actually this patient's done incredibly well. And there's another patient who's exactly the same from a molecular standpoint, who's not had that drug or supplement, who didn't do quite as well. And that's where actually that divergence of prescribing builds our modelling.
Okay, that makes sense. So
I guess what just add a tiny bit to that. I think if we were sending reports that just showed research into how the metabolic theory of cancer could support this patient, then I think the reception may be different. Some oncologists who are already predisposed to that would be like, "Oh, this is it. Well, yes, I understand this," and a lot who don't would be like, "Whoa, that's pushed the wrong buttons. I don't like it. Get rid of it." But because the research is just what you have to believe in to want to read and understand an Astron report, you have to believe in the scientific method. You have to believe in nothing more than that. You have to believe in peer-reviewed studies. And all we do is point you to the peer-reviewed studies that are most relevant to this particular case, given that there's infinite variation between cancer patients. And therefore, each individual oncologist, although they are interested in those drivers, they like, it's what they studied it for, it's what they came into it for, was to really understand this complexity. But there's just no way for them to do that on their own. So actually, this approach to it allows them to engage with the material in the way that they would like to, and to really understand the complexity of it. And I think that's another, building on everything Pad says. Of course, it is useful to us to get their varied experience, and people have different experience of dosages. They have different experience of all kinds of things that in the past was built up in their own medical experience, but was not empirically recorded for everyone. And there are all of these sampling biases. Doctors see the patients who their treatments work for longer than they see the patients that their treatments don't work for. That's just an unfortunate fact and sampling bias, that people get feedback that they're successful because they keep seeing patients for a long period of time who they have been successful with. But that's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, and they don't see the ones that their approaches haven't worked for. And what this data capture allows us is to be completely rigorous and unbiased about that.
Okay, so the costs coming down allow more data. More data eventually compounded over time will give you the broadest spectrum of this disease you can try and gather and find, and as a result, you'll be better informed. And see all
I'd put one extra step in that more data now, and the ability of AI to rapidly analyze all of published research allows us today to give oncologists what they need to make personalized recommendations for patients right now today. And then the data we gather from that allows us to empirically see what works to create even better treatments in future. But the treatments that are available today are informed by the best scientific research that's already happened. It's just that that's been blocked from getting to patients because oncologists, A, haven't known the specifics of each patient's disease because it was too expensive, and B, aren't able to do the research for each individual patient in order to do that matching. When we were building the AI platform, and Pad was doing this, and others, we have a kind of tumor board that does this manually, it was taking, how many hours per patient, Pad? Like 14, 16 hours per patient?
It's a long time, a full day.
And that was still only, we couldn't confidently say that we'd fully searched the space. Actually fully searching the space is, for each patient, is literally years to be confidently fully.
It's a lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing about the data, Ben, right, is that we always come back to something that Ben taught me when we were doing our MBA, but was all about trying to embody kind of Boyd's law. You probably explain this better than I do, Ben. So I'll let you explain it.
So Boyd's law is very much a startup theory or heuristic that speed of iteration beats quality of iteration every time. So doing more, trying something, seeing how it works, trying it again, changing it, tweaking it, rolling through, gets to better results than spending a long time doing one thing. There was a study that I'm going to partially remember where they got groups of people to do artworks or pictures of something, and one group had to just spend 10 hours creating one, and one group had to produce as many as they could. And the actual quality of the final piece was better from the people who had to produce as many as they could. They just incrementally got better than the people who were there with a blank page trying to do the best thing first off. That's one example, but it comes up absolutely everywhere. And I think drug discovery is an example of a very slow process that has to be successful. You can't spend 12 years doing it and find that it fails. Whereas this approach of being able to try a particular set of treatments, then we can look again in 3 months' time, see what are the signals that we're seeing there. Are we treating the pathways we want to treat? Are we addressing the issues we want to? Or do we need to try something different? Let's try something different and shift it. And that iterative approach and the ability to change around on the basis of data, I think is another strength of the model that we're using.
And it's also bound by the safety of the interventions as well. So obviously,
Right.
it's not that we're just suddenly using random things that have never been used in humans before. All of the things that we recommend, supplements, drugs, lifestyle changes, are all things that have been tried, tested, licensed for another indication. So they are safe. So it's iterating within those safe bounds.
Yeah, hard to iterate within the confines of a massive drug company or a traditional academia, right? That startup foundation gives you the license to have to apply that on a daily basis, I imagine. You've got this model internally, right? And you've got all this data it's sifting through, and coupled with your own unique experience since you've started Astron. Question for both of you individually. What surprised you most since starting it?
That's a great question. I think for me, what has surprised me most actually has been the response from the medical community, if I'm honest with you, because I think, I think every single person in this world, in this scientific medical world, especially when it comes to something as important and as cancer is to many people, we're all going to be touched by it at some points in our lives. It's going to mean something to all of us. We all want to do our best. Everyone's coming from a position where they want to help. None of us is truly armed with all of the information. And Actually, the willingness on all sides to be collaborative, to join forces, to actually admit that they don't have all the solutions has surprised me. I think our ability at Astron and the way that we have been transparent about our approach, actually, the willingness that we've had from universities, from testing companies, from professors to engage with us, to be really honest about the fact they don't fully understand the nuances of all of the pathways and the science that we're talking about, but they're willing to learn and get involved and put patients through this, registry study, etc., has been really surprising in a good way, actually, because it's really easy. I think a lot of patients, when they're going through the kind of going through appointments and clinics are overbooked and doctors are overworked and scans don't happen on time, and there's just such a there's so much there's absolutely no space in the system anymore. And just to see that actually there is still that real drive and focus on people to improve outcomes for patients on all sides, I'm not sure it should have surprised me, but it has. And it's been a really positive thing, actually, because it makes me think about, I think about Astron as a company, but more overarchingly, we just want the best outcomes for patients and on every level. And I think there's got to be a willingness, if we're going to succeed and patients are going to do better, there has to be a willingness on all sides to try and make this work. And I think that's absolutely there.
I guess coming in from the world of technology startups and moving into healthcare, there's probably it's not so much surprises as just amount of learning has been enormous, and working in a kind of new, totally new set of environments and with people with very, very different cultures to the kind of tech startup world I'm used to. I suppose something that I've specifically learned and maybe been surprised about is the applicability of a lot of the techniques of building startups to the healthcare world, and how it's made me slightly shift how I think about them. So a lot of, for example, when in product design, we talk a lot about the job that each product is doing, and when doing customer discovery, you try and identify the jobs that person is trying to get done, that your product needs to fill that hole so that they will buy it. And you spend a lot of time trying to understand what problems are people desperate to solve, and they're already paying to try and solve those, paying with money or in their time. And I've always thought that very much as a commercial process. But the more I look at things like the process of getting a clinical study set up with a university, it's a lot about understanding the individual motivations of each person in the system. Because on one level, people are motivated to do research that will help cancer patients. They're working in healthcare, they're working on oncology. Yes, clearly that's a good thing. But actually using those same startup methodologies to really understand, or those customer discovery methodologies to understand what has this person's boss set them as a goal? Like, what are they trying to do this quarter? What are they trying to do this year? When they come into work, what are they being asked to do each day? And how does this fit into that process? And by doing that, really understand how can we help get things taken up by these institutions? Because it's hard, right? People are getting change to happen in big institutions and organizations is difficult. But this approach, which has been sort of honed in the startup world, where broadly people have been trying to get big institutions to buy a new piece of software and really understand who is that solving a problem for exactly, how do we get an internal champion who wants to do this? That same process has really stood us in good stead when trying to get these big organizations to take on a new approach to oncology. And that, I think I've been positively surprised by that. I think very linked to what Pad's saying. I think perhaps our approach, coming in and listening and trying to understand everyone's motivations, has made it easier than if we had come in saying, we know the answer, you need to change your ways. That's not a way to make change happen. Whereas if you come in and understand what their problems are and then see, okay, well, a lot of these doctors, their problems are that they're already trying to create or match treatments to genomic reports, but at the moment they don't have any way of really tracking the outcomes. And so being part of our ecosystem and being able to see the outcomes reliably and track that, that's really positive. That's something they're really after.
Wonderful answers. I mean, both resonate a lot. I mean, I'm Pat, from your answer, I like to think that, what is that old Max Planck line, where science progresses one funeral at a time, being the dogma dies and allows room for more dogma. I'm pleased that your experience so far is not that, and it's much more sort of open to be to change people's minds, which is wonderful. And yeah, Ben, your answer was really cool. I imagine the sort of humility you need to build a startup, and taking that to this sort of complex problem, trying to understand the incentives at play, really do help. So yeah, really appreciate both your answers there. From the data, you must see emerging rumblings of interesting, novel, unique approaches to cancer. What types of interventions, and they could be broad, take it however you like, are you most excited about over the next 5-10 years?
Oh, that's a tricky one. And I think, again, the difference in molecular drivers for each patient, and therefore the direction and the research and the kind of things that are recommended for two people with the same type of colon cancer on paper are so broad, so diverse, that finding patterns right now, as a startup who's been going for a sort of year on this, is really difficult. We've got some, potential, medicines and supplements that, we see trends where they're recommended, or the research diverts to that again and again and again. Part of it is that they've been more researched than other things, if I'm honest with you. Part of it is that they actually just hit a lot of pathways. Absolutely. I think this is where actually to be able to give more granular information on this, Ben, this is where the registries really come into their own, if I'm completely honest with you. Because me sitting here as a doctor saying, okay, I had this patient who 3 months ago, and there are patients of ours who've done incredibly well and put individual case studies of their success, at least in the short-term success, on, social media and forums and things like that, and they're kind of visible for people to see. We're really careful not to get carried away by that, because there's always, and I'm sure these patients are going to do incredibly well, of course, but there's always, being driven by that kind of level of data, where what we want to do is to be able to demonstrate this out over a much more heterogeneous group of patients. We only do that by the registry study data, really, where we're getting large numbers of patients from really different types of cancers, different drivers, and showing that this molecular matching approach is helping them, and we're actually moving the molecular markers in the direction that we want to go, and that the patient's getting better results. Scans are more stable, time to recurrence is longer, or time to progression is longer. And we can kind of almost see a causation there, because we've got our intervention and the standard of care intervention. We've got what's happening at a molecular level going in the right direction. So we can say that this is what we were targeting and this is what's happened, tick. And then the outcomes of that is that actually it was relevant because the patient's done better for longer. And I think until we've got that level of granularity, I'm careful not to pinpoint too many things. I think really, in terms of what I'm most excited about over the next 5 to 10 years, it really is that group of patients. I think we're spending a lot of time and money in the cancer world on early detection. And I think that will be super important. But it's only going to be super important if, once we've detected people early at a stage where we can cure them with surgery or radiotherapy or stereotactic radiotherapy or gamma knife or whatever it might be, that we keep them cured. Because, there's a lot of people out there with curative disease who've got molecular disease in their lymph nodes or in their blood. And if we don't hit that and target it, it's a matter of time before they recur. And there are lots of techniques coming out. So our approach being an incredible approach for a lot of people. But actually, even now, the sort of focus that there is on treating people with individual metastases with focused ablation, laser ablation or CyberKnife or stereotactic radiosurgery or TACE, there are some amazing people doing amazing things, converting patients who traditionally would be told you've got metastatic cancer and you're now palliative, to still, look, we're trying to treat you here with a really curative intent. We're trying to keep you alive for a long period of time with an excellent and normal quality of life. I think that's what I'm super excited about. I think it's where we fit into that ecosystem, really.
I'll add something to that, which also slightly answers your question of what surprised me most, which will also talk to my ignorance about this before I began from a medical perspective. So I was surprised to learn that we all have circulating tumor cells from time to time and some level of cancer that our immune system deals with naturally. And that is just a natural part of being a human, that it doesn't, we have cancer, but we don't even know about it, and our immune system deals with it. And only sometimes does that then progress on to disease. And one of the things I think by this focusing on having this opportunity to create, in particular, give treatment options for oncologists at this after treatment with curative intent, where currently there's a total white space. So this is a space where we can do detection of recurrence early, and we can look at whether the treatments we're giving that are matched to the different genomic profiles and transcriptomic profiles, whether those are being effective in that recurrence setting. That data, it's much less likely that you get false positives. Whereas when you're doing early detection, it's really difficult, because if you go really early, you might detect a cancer that your body was going to deal with anyway. And therefore, if you put any treatments on it, you don't know that your treatments helped or whether it was going to go anyway. So it's much harder to get the statistical certainty. But something I'm excited by is the idea that if in that the sort of crucible of recurrent disease, we can prove out protocols and ways to combine treatments that can delay recurrence and can help people's bodies to fight recurrence of cancer, then it will be a very interesting next step to see, well, now can we combine that with early detection of cancer and see if we've got a very early detection of someone starting to form cancer, can we look at the molecular signature of those tumor cells and then use the protocols that have worked, or the approach to creating protocols that have worked in the recurrence setting, and see if those work preventatively. And the better we can get our understanding of how to prevent recurrence, the more likely it is we can then apply that in a prevention situation. And I think ultimately, right now, all the money and all the thinking is going on to killing cancer cells when they're there. But if we've got a paradigm that can move us to, let's stop it happening in the first place, and then once you've been treated, let's stop it recurring, that is actually quite a massive sea change in the whole way that we experience cancer and that we treat cancer. So that's something that really excites me.
Mm. I mean, you mentioned inflection points quite early on in the conversation. And actually, since we've been talking, it's counted about 5 or 6. From AI to the cost of the tests to even like the cultural adoption of, maybe I'll just get a second opinion as opposed to just one type of doctor. People are way more open to these different things and different approaches as well. So yeah, very interesting to hear what you guys are building. Would love to get you on maybe in a 12 months time again, see how you're getting on. What have you learned? How's the progress going? I've loads of questions didn't get around to, but I always think that's a good mark of a good podcast, right? You sort of tangents take over, and that's wonderful. Thanks so much for doing this, guys. I really appreciate it. Where can we find out more about Astron? Where can we find out more about you both? Where can people reach out and ask questions if they have any?
Yeah, so I guess the website is astron.health. So go there. I mean, for anyone interested as a patient or a carer for a patient, on there you can just book a call with Pad, and and talk further there. So, and there's also links to all kinds of videos on there and further materials. We also normally once or twice a month we have webinar calls that we'll advertise and you can book in for, where again we just go through more of the background, but also answer people's questions and generally talk to. So there's open patient webinars where we just answer questions. We also get on people who've got specific different approaches, whether it be metabolic, whether it be other things that we can that are kind of leading thinkers in the space, and have those there. So engage in any or all of those.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on. A load of questions didn't ask. We'd love to get you guys back on again. And yeah, we'll mention everything you mentioned. We'll put in the show notes so people can try and find it pretty easily. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone, if you made it this far. And yeah, appreciate you both.
Thanks so much.
Ben.